Not so long ago, in a world full of strife, a man born a wolf, living a dual life. With magic in his veins, he walked the school hall, learning the arts, answering the call. But fear was a cloak he had to wear tight, hiding his truth, keeping darkness from light. Those who were scared turned away in despair, yet he bore the burden, he chose to take care. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land.
Okay, yeah, new song. Okay, what background noise am I hearing now? Do you hear it? I don't know what it is. No cat's in the room with me. That sucks. Anyway, how you doing this evening, Guilty? Anyway, it is Thursday, and Thursday we do mysteries. For now. Since we're not halfway through in this book yet. But after this book, I'll have to find something new to do on Thursday nights. I have a few ideas. I may go ahead and read the Bird Cochran book, just so I can have it in my setup. As I don't do many biographies, and a biography western could be interesting. Hopefully I won't have too many hiccup issues. Oh yeah. Yeah, let's go ahead and get over to the study. But again, we are doing more Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. I have added the cat cam to this one, just for the hell of it. I may eventually make the cat cam a redeem. See if the scales are right. Hydrates. Okay. May or may not have alcohol in it. I'm kidding. Of course, it has alcohol in it. Anymore, I kind of need it. Okay. Ouch. Let's see. Oh, another one of Professor Von Dusen's problems. This will. Let's see. How long is this one? Is this a Phantom Motor Car? Yes, it is. Okay. Okay. There's a Fido in chat. Yeah. But anyway, it's almost 9:10, so I should probably get ready to read. So, in our continued reading, our first story for the evening, Professor Von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 4, The Phantom Motor Car. Two dazzling white eyes bulged suddenly through the night as a motor car swept round a curve in the wide road and laid a smooth, glaring pathway ahead. Even at the distance, the rhythmical, clacking chug informed Special Constable Baker that it was a gasoline car, and the headlong swoop of the unblinking lights towards him made him instantly aware of the fact that the speed ordinance of Yarborough County was being a little more than broken. It was being obliterated. Now, the county of Yarborough was one wide expanse of summer estates and superbly kept roads, level as a floor, and offered distracting temptations to the dangerous pastime of racing. But against this was the fact that the county was particularly about its speed laws, so particular, in fact, that it had stationed 100 men on its highways to abate the nuisance. Incidentally, it had found that keeping record of infractions of the law was an excellent source of income. 40 miles an hour of an inch, remarked Baker to himself. He rose from a camp stool where he was wont to make himself comfortable on watch from 6 o'clock until midnight, picked up his lantern, and turned up the light, and stepped out to the edge of the road. He was already remaining on watch at the same place, at one end of a long stretch which motorists had unanimously dubbed the Trap. The Trap was singularly tempting. A perfectly masticated road led between a macadamized road between two tall wall stones with only a sinuous twist in it to make each end invisible from the center. Another man, Special Constable Bowman, was stationed at the other end of the trap, and there was a telephonic communication between the points, enabling the two to check on each other, and incidentally, if one failed to stop a car or get its number, the other would. At least, that was the theory. So now, with the utmost confidence, Baker waited beside the road. Approaching lights were only a couple of 100 yards away. At the proper instant, he would raise his lantern. The car would stop. Its occupants would protest, and then the county would add a mite to its general fund for making the roads even better and more tempting for motorists. Or sometimes the cars did not stop. In that event, it was part of the special constable's duty to get the number as it flew past, and reference to the monthly motor car register gave name of the owner. An extra fine was always imposed in such cases. Without the slightest diminution of speed, the car came hurtling on towards him and swung wide so as to take the straight path of the trap at full speed. At the psychological instant, Baker stepped out onto the road and waved his lantern. "Stop!" he commanded. The crackling chug came on, heedless of the cry. The car was almost on him before he leaped out of the road, a feat at which he was particularly expert. And then it flashed by and plunged into the trap. Baker was, at the instant, so busily engaged in getting out of the way that he could not read the number, but he was not disconcerted because he knew that there was no escape from the trap. On the one side, a solid stone wall 8 feet high marked the eastern boundary of John Phelps Stocker Country Estate. On the other side, a stone fence 9 feet tall marked the western boundary of the Thomas Q. Rogers Country Estate. There was no turnout, no place, no possible way for an auto to get out of the trap, except at one of the 2 ends guarded by the special constables. So Baker, perfectly confident of the results, seized the phone. "Car coming through 60 miles an hour, he bawled. "It won't stop. I missed the number. Look out." "All right," answered Special Constable Bowman. For 10, 15, 20 minutes, Baker expected a call from the other end. It did not come, and finally he picked up the phone again. No answer. He rang several times, battered the box, and did some tricks with the receiver. Still, no answer. Finally, he began to feel worried. He remembered that at the same post, one special constable had been badly hurt by a reckless chauffeur who refused to stop or turn his car when the officer stepped out onto the road. In his mind's eye, he saw Bowman now lying helpless, perhaps badly injured. If the car had held the pace at which it had passed him, it would certainly be death for whoever might be unlucky enough to get in its path. With these thoughts running through his head, and with genuine solitude for Bowman, Baker at last walked on the road of the trap toward the other end. The feeble rays of his lantern showed an unbroken line of the cold stone walls on each side. There was no shrubbery of any sort, only a narrow strip of grass close to the road. The more Baker considered the matter, the more anxious he became, and he increased his pace a little. As he turned a gentle curve, he saw the lantern in the distance come slowly towards him. It was evidently being carried by someone who was looking carefully along each side of the road. "Hello!" called Baker when the lantern came within distance. "Is that you, Bowman?" "Yes," called the other haloed response. The lanterns moved in and met. Baker's solicitude for the other constable had quickly changed to curiosity. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "The motor," replied Bowman. "It didn't come through my end, and I thought perhaps there had been an incident, or so I walked along looking for it. I haven't seen anything." "Didn't come through your end?" repeated Baker with amazement. "Why, it must have. It didn't come back my way, and I haven't passed it, so it must have gone through." "Well, it didn't," declared Bowman conclusively. "I was on the lookout for it, too, standing beside the road. There hasn't been a car through my end in an hour." Special Constable Baker raised his lantern until the rays fell full on the face of Special Constable Bowman, and for an instant they stared at each other. Suspicion glowed from the keen, avaricious eyes of Baker. "How much did they give you to let them by?" he asked. "Give me?" exclaimed Baker in righteous indignation. "Give me? Nothing. I haven't seen a car." A slight sneer curled on the lips of Special Constable Baker. "Of course, that's all right to report at headquarters," he said. "But I happen to know that the motor came in here, that it couldn't come back any of my way, that it couldn't get out except at the ends. Therefore, it went your way." He was silent for a moment. "And whatever you got, Jim, seems to me I ought to get half." Then the worm, i.e. Bowman, turned. A polite curl appeared around his lips and was permitted to show through the grimaced mustache. "I guess," he said deliberately, "you think because you do that, everybody else does. I haven't seen any motors." "Don't I always give you half, Jim?" Baker demanded, almost pleadingly. "Well, I haven't seen any car, and that's all there is of it. If it didn't go back your way, there wasn't any car." There was a pause. Bowman was framing up something particularly unpleasant. "You're seeing things. That's the matter with you." So it was discord between two officers of the county of Yarborough. After a while, they separated with mutual sneers and derision, and went back to their respective posts. Each was thoughtful in his own way. At 5 minutes to midnight, just before the off-duty went, Baker called Bowman on the phone again. "I've been thinking the thing over, Jim. I guess it would be just as well as if we didn't report or say anything about it when we go in," said Baker slowly. "It seems foolish if we say anything about it, and it would give the boys a laugh at us." "Just as you say," responded Bowman. Relations between Constable Baker and Constable Bowman were strained in the morrow. But they walked along side by side to their respective posts. Baker stopped at his end of the trap, and Bowman did not even look around. "You'd better keep your eyes open tonight, Jim," Baker called out at last word. "I had 'em open last night," was the disgusted report. 7, 8 o'clock passed. 2 or 3 cars had gone through the trap at moderate speed, and one had been warned by Baker. At a few minutes past 9, he was staring down the road which led into the trap when he saw something that brought him quickly to his feet. It was a pair of dazzling white eyes far away. He recognized them, the mysterious car from the night before. "I'll get her this time," he muttered grimly between closed teeth. Then, when the onrushing car was full 200 yards away, Baker planted himself in the middle of the road and began to swing the lantern. The car seemed, if anything, to be traveling even faster than on the previous night. At 100 yards, Baker began to shout. Still, the car did not lessen speed, merely rushed on. Again, at the psychological instant, Baker jumped. The car whisked by as the chauffeur gave a dexterous twist to prevent running down the special constable. Safely out of its way, Baker turned and stared after it, trying to read the number. He could see there was a number because the whiteboard swung on the tail axle, but he could not make out the figures. Dust in a swaying car conspired to defeat him. And he did see, too, that there were 4 persons in the car dimly silhouetted against the light reflected from the road. It was useless, of course, to conjecture as to the sex, for even he looked as fast receding car swerved around the turn and was lost to sight. Again, he rushed to the telephone. Bowman responded promptly. "The car's gone in again," Baker called. 90 miles an hour. Look out." "I'm looking," responded Bowman. "Let me know what happens," Baker shouted. With the receiver at his ear, he stood for 10 or 15 minutes. Then Bowman helloed from the other end. "Well," Baker responded, "get 'em?" "No car passed through and there's none in sight," said Bowman. "But it went in," insisted Baker. "Well, it didn't come out here," declared Bowman. "Walk along the road till I meet you and look out for it." Then was repeated the search of the night before. When the 2 men met in the middle of the trap, their faces were blank. Blank as the high stone walls which stared at them from either side. "Nothing," replied Baker. "Nothing," echoed Baker. Special Constable Bowman perched his head on one side and scratched his grizzly chin. "You're not trying to put up a job on me, are you?" he inquired coldly. "You did see a car." "I certainly did," declared Baker, and a belligerent tone underlay his manner. "I certainly saw it, Jim, and if it didn't come your way to the end, why... He paused, and then glanced quickly beside him. The action inspired a suddenly similar one from Bowman's part. "Maybe," said Bowman after a minute, "maybe it's a spook car?" "Well, it must be," mused Baker. "You know as well as I do that no car can get out of this trap except for the ends. The car came in here, it didn't come out there. Now where is it?" Bowman stared at him in a moment, and picked up his lantern and shook his head solemnly, and wandered back the road to his post. On his way, he glanced around quickly, apprehensively. 3 times. Baker did the same 4 times. On the 3rd night, the phantom car appeared and disappeared precisely as it had done previously. Again, Baker and Bowman met halfway between the posts and talked it over. "I tell you what, Baker," said Bowman in conclusion. "Maybe you're just imagining that you see the car. Maybe it was at your end I couldn't see it." Special Constable Baker was distinctly hurt at the indignation. "All right, Jim," he said at last. "If you think that way about it, we'll swap posts tomorrow night. We won't have to say anything about it until we report." "Now that's the talk," exclaimed Bowman with an air of approaching enthusiasm. "I bet I won't see it." On the following night, Special Constable Bowman made himself comfortable on Special Constable Baker's camp stool, and he saw the phantom car. It came upon him with a rush and a cracking chug of the engine, then sped on, leaving him nerveless. He called Baker over the wire, and Wire watched half an hour for the phantom. It did not appear. Ultimately, all things reached the newspapers, so the story of the phantom motor car, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, smiled incredulously when his city editor laid aside the inevitable cigar and tersely stated the known facts. The known facts in this instance were meager, almost to a disappearing point. They consisted merely of a corroborated statement that the motor car, solid and tangible enough to all appearances, had rushed into the trap each night and totally disappeared. But there was enough of a bizarre about it to pique the curiosity, to make one wonder. So Hatch journeyed down to Yarborough Country, on an hour's ride from the city, and met and talked to Baker and Bowman, and then, in broad daylight, strolled along the trap twice, It was a leisurely, thorough investigation with the end in view of finding out how the automobile, once inside, might get out again without going out the other end. On the first trip through, Hatch paid particular attention to the Thomas Q. Rogers side of the road. The wall, 9 feet high, was an unbroken line of stone, with not the slightest indication of a secret way through it anywhere. Secret way. Hatch smiled at the phrase, but when he reached the other end, Bowman's end of the trap, he was perfectly convinced of one thing, that no motor car had left the hard, macadamized road to go over, under, or through the Thomas Q. Rogers wall. Returning still leisurely, he paid strict attention to the John Phelps stalker side, and when he reached the other end, Baker's end, he was convinced of another thing, that no motor car had left the road to go over, under, or through the John Phelps stalker side. Hatch saw no shrubbery along the road, nothing but a strip of scrupulously cared-for grass. Therefore the phantom car could not be hidden at any time, day or night. Hatch failed, too, to find any holes in the road, so the car did not go down to the earth. At this point, he involuntarily glanced up at the blue sky. Perhaps, he thought whimsically, the automobile was a strange sort of bird, and he stopped suddenly. "By George!" he exclaimed. "I wonder if—" And the remainder of the afternoon he spent systematically making inquiries. He went from house to house, the Stalker house, the Rogers house, both of which at the time were unoccupied, then the cottage, a cabin, a hut in the turn, but he did not seem overladen with information when he joined Special Constable Baker at the end of the trap that evening about 7 o'clock. Together they rehearsed the strange points of the mystery as the shadows grew around them, until finally the darkness was so dense that Baker's lantern was the only bright spot of sight. As the chill of evening closed in, a certain odd tone crept into their voices. Occasionally a motor car bowled along, and each time as it hove in sight, Hatch glanced at Baker questioningly, and each time Baker shook his head. At each time, too, he called Bowman in this manner, accounting for every car that went into the trap. "It'll come along all right," said Baker after a long silence, "and I know it'll be a minute and rounds a curve towards us, and it'll be 2 headlights in 1,000. They sat still and smoked. After a while, and 2 dazzling white lights burst into view down the road, and Baker, with excitement, dropped his pipe. "That's her," he declared. "Look at her coming!" And Hatch did look at her coming. The speed of the mysterious car was such to make one look like eyes of a giant, and 2 lights came toward them, and Baker perfunctorily went to the motions of attempting to stop it. The car fairly whizzed past them, and the rush of air which tugged at their coats was convincing enough that it was solid. Hatch strained his eyes to read the number of the motor as flashed by, but it was hopeless. The tail of the car was lost in an eddying whirl of dust. "She certainly does travel," commented Baker softly. "She does," Hatch assented. Then, for the benefit of the newspaperman, Baker called Bowman on the wire. "Car's coming again," he shouted. "Look out and let me know." Bowman, at his end, waited 20 minutes, then made the usual report. The car had not passed. Hutchinson Hatch was a calm, cold, dispassionate young man, but now a queer, creepy sensation stole along his spinal column. He lighted a cigarette and pulled himself together with a jerk. "There's one way to find out where it goes," he declared last emphatically, "and that's to place a man in the middle just beyond the bend of the trap and let him wait to see. If the car goes up, down, or even evaporates, he'll see and can tell us." Baker looked at him curiously. "I'd hate to be the man in the middle," he declared. There was something of uneasiness in his manner. "I think I would too," responded Hatch. On the following evening, consequent of the appearance of the story in the Phantom Motor in Hatch's paper, there were 12 other reporters on hand. Most of them were openly, flagrantly skeptical. They even insinuated that no one had seen the car. Hatch smiled wisely. "Wait," he advised with deep conviction. So when the darkness fell that evening, the newspaper men of the great city had entered into a conspiracy to capture the phantom car. 13 of them, making a total of 15 men with Baker and Bowman, were on hand, and they agreed to a suggestion for all to take positions along the road of the trap from Baker's post to Bowman's. Watch for the car and so see what happened, and compare notes afterwards. So they scattered themselves along a few hundred feet apart and waited. That night the Phantom did not appear at all, and the 12 reporters jeered at Hutchinson Hatch and told him to light his pipe with the story. The next night, when Hatch and Baker and Bowman alone were watching, the Phantom motor reappeared. Whereupon, like a child with a trouble problem, Hatch took the entire matter and laid it before Professor von Dusen, the master brain which had, at various times, untangled facts from a score of more intricate matters for his benefit. The thinking machine, with squint eyes turned steadily upward and long, slender fingers pressed tip to tip, listened to the story. "Now I know, of course, that motor cars can't fly," Hatch burst out savagely in conclusion. "And if this one doesn't fly, there's no earthly way for it to get out of the trap, as they call it. I went over the thing carefully. I even went so far as to examine the ground and the tops of the walls to see if a runway had been let down for the auto to go over." The thinking machine squinted at him inquiringly. "Are you sure you saw a motor car?" he demanded irritably. "Certainly I saw it," blurted out the reporter. "I not only saw it, I smelt it. And just to convince myself it was real, I tossed my cane in front of the thing and it smashed it to toothpicks." "Perhaps then, if everything has, as you say, the car actually has wings," remarked the scientist. The reporter stared into the calm, inscrutable face of the thinking machine, fearing first that he might not have heard right. Then he concluded that he had. "You mean," he inquired eagerly, "that the Phantom may be a motor aeroplane affair, and that it actually does fly?" "It's not at all possible." Let me try that again. "It's not at all impossible," commented the scientist. "I had an idea something like that myself," Hatch explained, "and questioned every soul within a mile or so, but I didn't get anything." "The perfect stretch of road there might be a very place at some daring experiments to get up sufficient speed to soar a short distance in the light machine," continued the scientist. "Light machine," Hatch repeated. "Didn't I tell you that the car had 4 people in it?" "4 people!" exclaimed the scientist. Dear me, that does make a difference. Of course 4 people would be too great to lift up for it." For 10 minutes he sat silent. The tiny cobweb lines appeared his dome-like brow. Then he rose and passed into the adjoining room. After a moment, Hatch heard the telephone bell jingle. 5 minutes later, the thinking machine appeared and scowled upon him unpleasantly. "I suppose what you really want to say is that if the car is a material thing, and to whom it belongs?" he queried. "Well, that's it," agreed the reporter. "And of course, why does it do what it does, and how it gets out of the trap?" "Do you happen to know a fast, long-distance bicycle rider?" demanded the scientist abruptly. "A dozen of them," replied the reporter promptly. "I think I see the idea, but—" "You haven't the faintest inkling of an idea," declared the thinking machine positively. "If you can arrange with a fast rider who can go the distance, it might be 30, 40, 50 miles, we may end up a little fair without difficulty." In these circumstances, Professor von Dusen, scientist and logician, met the famous Jimmy Thalhauer, the world's champion long-distance bicyclist. He held every record from 5 miles up to including 6 hours, had won twice the 6-day race, and was, altogether, a master in his field. He came in chewing a toothpick. There were introductions. You ride the bicycle? Inquired the crusty little scientist. Some, confessed the champion modestly with a wink at Hatch. Can you keep up with a motor car for a distance of, say, 30 or 40 miles? I can keep up with anything that ain't got wings, was the response. Well, to tell you the truth, volunteered Professor Von Dusen, there is a growing belief that this particular car has wings. However, if you can keep up with it... Quit, you're kidding, said the champion, easily. I can ride rings around anything on wheels. I'll start behind it and beat it to where it's going. Professor Von Dusen examined the champion, Jimmy Thalhauer, with a curiosity. In the seclusion of his laboratory, he had never had the opportunity of meeting such another worldly young person. How fast can you ride, Mr. Thalhauer? He asked at last. I'm ashamed to tell you, confided the champion in a hushed voice. I can ride so fast that I scare myself. He paused for a moment. But it seems to me, he said, if there's 30 or 40 miles to do, I ought to do it on a motorcycle. Now that's just the point, exclaimed Professor Von Dusen. A motorcycle will make noise, and if anything of that sort could be used, we should have hired a fast motorcycle. The proposition briefly is, I want you to ride without lights behind a motor car, which may also run without lights, and find out where it goes. No occupant of the vehicle must know that they're being followed. Without lights, repeated the champion. Gee, rubber shoe, eh? The thinking machine looked in his bewilderment. Yes, that's it, Hatch answered for him. I guess it's good for a 4-column head, inquired the champion. Special pictures posted for the champion, eh? Yes, Hatch replied. Tracked on a bicycle sounds good to me, eh? Hatch nodded. So arrangements were concluded, and then and there Professor Von Dusen gave definite and conclusive instructions to the champion. While these apparently bore broadly on the problem in hand, they conveyed absolutely no inkling of his plan to the reporter. At the end, the champion arose to go. You're a most extraordinary young man, Mr. Thalhauer, commented the scientist, not without admiration for the sturdy, powerful figure. And as Hatch accompanied the champion out of the room and down the steps, Jimmy smiled with an easy grace. Nutty old guy, ain't he? Night. Utter blackness, relieved only by a white ribbon-like road which winds its way mistily under a starless sky. Shadowy hedges lined either side, and occasionally a tree thrust itself upward out of the somberness. A murmur of human voices in the shadows, and the crackling chug of an engine with the motor car moves slowly without lights onto the road. There's a sudden clatter of an engine at high speed, and the car rushes away. From the hedge comes a faint rustle of leaves in the wind, stirring when a figure moves impalpably. The movement to end it becomes a separate entity, a quick movement and the creak of a leather bicycle saddle. Silently, a single figure, bent low over the handlebars, moves after the car with an ever-increasing momentum. Then a long, desperate race. For mile after mile, the car goes on. The silent cyclist has crept up almost on the rear axle and hangs there doggedly as a racer to his pacer. On and on they rushed together toward the darkness, the chauffeur moving with a perfect knowledge of his road, the single rider behind clinging on grimly with set teeth. The powerful piston-like legs move up and down to the beat of the engine. At last, with a dust-dry throat and stinging, aching eyes, the cyclist feels the pace slacken, and instantly he drops back out of sight. It is only by sound that he follows now. The car stops. The cyclist is lost in the shadows. 2 or 3 hours, the car stands deserted and silent. At last the voices are heard again. The car stirs and moves away. The cyclist drops in behind. Another race, which leads off in another direction. Finally, from a knoll, the lights of the city are seen. 10 minutes elapse, and the motor car stops. The headlights flare up. and more leisurely proceeds on its way. On the following evening, Professor Von Dusen and Hutchinson Hatch call upon the Fielding Stanwood, president of the Fortis National Bank. Mr. Stanwood looked at them in interrogative eyes. "We call to inform you, Mr. Stanwood," exclaimed the Professor Von Dusen, "that a box of securities, probably United States bonds, is missing from your bank." "What?" exclaimed Mr. Stanwood, his face paled. "Robbery?" "I only know the bonds were taken out of the vault tonight by Mr. Joseph Marsh, your assistant cashier," said the scientist, "and that he, together with 3 other men, left the bank with the box and are now at a place I can name." Mr. Stanwood was staring at him in amazement. "You know where they are?" he demanded. "I said I did," replied the scientist shortly. "You must inform the police at once and—" "I don't know that there has been an actual crime," interrupted the scientist. "I do know that every night for a week these bonds have been taken out, through a conveyance of your watchman, and in each instance have been returned intact before morning. They will be returned tonight, therefore I would advise, if you act, not to do so until the 4 men return with the bonds." It was a singular party which met the private office of President Stanwood at the bank just after midnight. Marsh and 3 companions, formerly under arrest, were present, as were President Stanwood, Professor Von Dusen, Hutchinson Hatch, besides detectives. Marsh had the bonds under his arm when he was taken. He talked freely when questioned. "I will admit," he said without hesitation, "that I have acted beyond my rights in removing the bonds from the vault here, and there is no ground for prosecution. I am a responsible officer of the bank and have violated no trust. Nothing is missing, nothing is stolen. Every bond that went out of the bank is here." "But why? Why did you take the bonds?" demanded Mr. Stanwood. Marsh shrugged his shoulders. "It's what we called a get-rich-quick scheme," said Professor Von Dusen. "Mr. Hatch and I made some investigations today. Mr. Marsh and these others 3 have been interested in a business venture which is ethically dishonest, but which is within the law. They have sought backing for the scheme amounting to about $1 million. Those 4 or 5 men of means by whom they have discussed the matter have called each other each night of the week in Martian's country place. It was necessary to make them believe that there was already $1 million or so in the scheme, so these bonds were borrowed and represented to the owned by themselves. They were taken to and fro between the bank to his home in a kind of motor car. This is really what happened based on the knowledge which Mr. Hatch has gathered, and what I myself developed by use of a little logic." And his statement of the affair proved to be correct. Marsh and the others admitted it. It was while Professor Von Dusen was homeward bound that he explained the Phantom Car affair to Hatch. "The Phantom Car, as you call it," he said, "is a vehicle in which the bonds were moved about. The phantom idea came merely by chance. On the night the vehicle was first noticed, it was rushing along, we will say, to reach Marsh's house in time for an appointment. A road map will show you that the most direct line from the bank to Marsh's is through the trap. If an automobile should go halfway through there and cut across the Stockler estate to the other road, in the distance would have lessened by 5 miles. The salvaging at first, of course, valuable to the car that they rushed into the trap, was merely to take it across the Stockler estate to the front road. Of course, they always returned to the bank by another route." "But how?" demanded Hatch. "There's no road there." "I learned by phone that Mr. Stocker, there is a narrow walk from a very narrow gate to Stocker's wall to the trap leading through the grounds and another road. The Phantom Car wasn't really a motor at all. It was merely 2 motorcycles arranged seating and a steering apparatus. The French army has been experimenting with them. The motor car cycles are, of course, separate machines, and as such they were easy to trundle them through the narrow gate and across to the other side. The seats are light and they can be carried under the arm. I knew instantly that the Phantom must be when I knew that there was no ground through No road to only a gateway. Oh, exclaimed Hatch suddenly. Then, after a minute, but what did Jimmy Thowler have to do? He waited on the road to the other path of the side, the opposite end of the trap, the scientist explained. When the auto was brought through, put together, he followed it to the Marshes' home and there to the bank. The rest of it, you and I worked out today. It's merely logic, Mr. Hatch. Logic. There was a pause. That Mr. Thowler is really a marvelous young man, Mr. Hatch. Don't you think? Thank you for the hydrate. Von Dusen's voice does that to me. Okay. Guess I will go ahead and take the break now and get the ads taken care of. I wouldn't think 9 pages would take me... Oh, they took me maybe half an hour. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, gonna go ahead and do the break now. I'll be back in a few. I'm definitely gonna have to stretch for a moment. I can't really call the cats lazy for not being in here. I'm pretty sure they're asleep in my chair in the living room. But yeah. I really need a new chair. Okay. So there are 2 more of our Dusen's problems left in this book. Oop, let's read this. I don't know what that sound is. Why does it sound like water doing something? That's going to drive me crazy. Not that it's a very long trip. But anyway, yeah. Our next story for tonight, Professor Von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 5. I'm not sure what it is. It's coming through on my microphone, though. At least my microphone's picking it up. I guess it's not coming through because I can turn up the volume on my speakers as well. My audio. I don't have a radiator. I don't have a radiator. My heater's not on. My computer is pretty much surrounded by sound foam, so I don't know what it's coming from. Well, it's not interference from my lamp. My Coke's flat, so it's not picking that up, which would just be amazing if it could. I don't know, I guess I'm just hearing things. I can't be hearing things because OBS is picking it up. Let's see if it'll record it. Okay. Unless there's a ghost hitting a bong around here, which is... don't even think that would be it, but still, that's kind of what it sounds like. But the audio was coming to me through my computer. Because if I mute my computer, it stops. And then the only thing I can hear is... unless it's my computer's fans, but... I don't know, because I can't even hear the fans normally, but if the microphone's picking it up... And I have a shock vibration control on my mic now, so it doesn't vibrate. So I don't really know what would be causing it. Okay. I will be right back. I'm hearing music from another room. Which in itself is creepy since I live by myself. Okay, that part was my imagination. It wasn't coming from outside the room, it was coming from inside the room. This is what happens when you lurk in other people's channels to try to support them. Unless you hear music right now. Because I'm not hearing the music with my headphones off, so I don't know where it's coming from. Oh well. Let's try this again. So our next story for the night Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 5. The Problem of the Motorboat. Captain Hank Barber, master mariner, gripped to the bow rail of the Lydion and peered off through the semi-fog into the early morning of the dark streak flashing along through the gray-green waters. It was a motorboat of long, graceful lines, and a singular figure, that of a man, sat upright at her helm, staring uncompromisingly ahead. She nosed through a roller, staggered a little, righted herself, and sped on as the sheet of spray swept over her. The helmsman sat motionless, heedless of the stinging splash of wind-driven water in his face. "She's sure going some," remarked Captain Hank reflectively. "By Ginger, if she keeps up into Boston Harbor, she won't stop on this side of the public gardens." Captain Hank watched the boat curiously until she was swallowed up, lost in the mist, then turned to his own affairs. He was a couple of miles out from Boston Harbor going in. It was 6 o'clock in a gray morning. A few minutes after the disappearance of the motorboat, Captain Hank's attention was attracted by the hoarse shriek of a whistle 200 yards away. He dimly traced through the mist the gigantic lines of a great vessel. It seemed to be a ship of war. It was only a few minutes after Captain Hanks lost sight of the motorboat that she was sighted again. This time she flashed into Boston Harbor at full speed. She fled past, almost under the prow of the pilot boat, bound out, and was hailed. At the mess table later, the pilot's man on watch made a remark about her. "Going? Well, she wasn't, though. Never saw one thing pass so close to another in my life without scrubbing the paint off of it. She was so close up I could touch her, and when I spoke to her, the feller didn't even look up. She just kept on a-going. I told him a few things that was good for his soul." Inside Boston Harbor, the motorboat performed a miracle. Pursuing a course which was singularly erratic and at speed more than dangerous, she reeled through the surge of the sea, regardless the lack of fog, the proximity of other vessels, and a heavy wash upon larger craft. She was narrowly missed by a tug. There she skimmed by a slow-moving tramp, and warning shout was raised. A fisherman swore at her as only a fisherman can. And finally, when she passed into a clear space, headed for a dock at top speed, she was most unanimously condemned craft that ever came into Boston Harbor. "Yes, that's a boat," remarked the aged salt facetiously, as he gazed at her from the dock. "If that fool don't take up some speed often, and hers go right through all right, wharf and all." Still, the man in the boat made no motion. The whiz of her motor, plainly heard in a sudden silence, was undiminished. Suddenly the tumult of warning was renewed. Only a chance would prevent a smash. Then Big John Dawson appeared on the string piece of the dock. Big John had a voice that was noted from Newfoundland to Norfolk for its depth and width, and possessed objectory powers which at once the awe and admiration of the fishing fleet. "You idiot!" bellowed the impressive helmsman. "Shut off that power! You'll throw a helium!" There was no response. The boat came on directly toward the dock where Big John and his fellows were gathered. The fishermen and loungers saw that a crash was coming and scattered from the string piece. "You stupid fool!" said Big John resignedly. And then came the crash, the rending of timbers, the silence gave for the grinding whir of the motor. Big John ran to the end of the wharf and peered down. The speed of the motor had half-driven the boat halfway up onto the float, which careened perilously. The man had been thrown forward and lay huddled up, face downward and motionless on the float. The dirty water lapped at him greedily. Big John shinnied down to the float, crept cautiously to the huddled figure, and turned it up faceward. He gazed for an instant at the wide, staring eyes, then turned from the curious ones peering down from the dock. "Well, no wonder he didn't stop," he said in an odd tone. "The fool is dead." Willing hands gave aid, and after a minute the lifeless figure lay on the dock. It was that of a man in uniform, apparently the uniform of a foreign navy. He seemed about 45 years old, large and powerful of frame, with a sun-browned face of a seaman. The jet black of the mustache and goatee were startling against the dead color of the face. The hair was tinged with gray, and on the back of the left hand was a single letter, D, tattooed in blue. "Oh, he's French," said Big John authoritatively, "and that's the uniform of a French naval captain." He looked puzzled a moment as he stared at the figure. "And there ain't been a French man-o'-war in Boston Harbor for 6 months. After a while the police came, and with Detective Mallory, a big man of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and finally Dr. Clow, medical examiner. While the detective questioned the fishermen and those who had witnessed the crash, Dr. Clow examined the body. "An autopsy will be necessary," he announced as he rose. "How long has he been dead?" asked the detective. 8 or 10 hours, I should say. The cause of death doesn't appear. There is no shot or knife wound, so far as I can see." Detective Mallory closely examined the dead man's clothing. There was no name or tailor mark. The linen was new. The name of the maker of the shoes had been cut out with a knife. There was nothing in his pockets, not a piece of paper, nor even a vagrant coin. Then Detective Mallory turned his attention to the boat. Both hull and motor were of French manufacture. Long, deep scratches on each side showed the name had been removed. Inside the boat, the detective saw something white and picked it up. It was a handkerchief, a lady's handkerchief, with the initials E.M.B. in the corner. "A woman's in it," soliloquized the detective. Then the body was removed and carefully secluded from the prying eyes of the press. Thus, no picture of the dead man appeared. Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, and others asked many questions. Detective Mallory hinted vaguely at international questions. The dead man was a French officer, he said, and there might be something back of it. "I can't tell you all of it," he said wisely, "but my theory is complete. It is murder. The victim was a captain of a French man-o'-war. His body was placed in a motorboat, possibly a part of the fittings of the warship, and the boat was set adrift. I can say no more." "Your theory is complete, then?" Hatch remarked casually. "Except the name of the man, the matter of death, the motive of the name of the ship, and the presence of the handkerchief, and the precise reason why the body should be disposed of in this fashion, instead of being cast into the sea." The detective snorted. Hatch went away and made some inquiries of his own account. Within half a dozen hours, he had satisfied himself by telegraph that no French man-of-war craft had been within 500 miles of Boston for 6 months. Thus, the mystery grew deeper. 1,000 questions to which he seemed no answer arose. "Hey, Matsu." It was this point, the day following that the events related, that the problem of the motorboat came to the attention of Professor von Dusen, the world's foremost analytical brain. The scientist listened interestedly, but petulantly, to the story Hatch told. "Has there been an autopsy yet?" he asked at last. "It is set for 11 o'clock today," replied the reporter. "It is now after 10. "I shall attend it," said the scientist. Medical examiner Clow welcomed the eminent Professor von Dusen proffer of assistance in the capacity of M.D., while Hatch and other reporters impatiently cooled their toes at the curb. Yes, Thurston stories have been interesting. In 2 hours, the autopsy had been completed. Professor von Dusen amused himself by studying the insignia of the dead man's uniform, leaving it to Dr. Clow to make a startling statement to the press. The man had not been murdered. He had died of heart failure. There was no poison in the stomach, nor was there a knife or pistol wound. Then the inquisitive press poured on the flood of questions. Who had scratched off the name of the boat? Dr. Clow didn't know. Why had it been scratched off? Still, he didn't know. How did it happen that the name of the maker of the shoes had been cut out? Oh, yeah. That's horrible. Interesting fact, though. He shrugged his shoulders. What did the handkerchief have to do with it? Really, he couldn't conjecture. Was there any inkling to the dead man's identity? Not so far as he knew. Any scar on the body which might lead to an identification? No. Hatch made a few mental comments on the officials in general, and skillfully steered the professor away from the other reporters. Did the man die of a heart failure? He asked flatly. No, he did not, was a curt reply. It was poison. But the medical examiner specifically stated that there was no poison in his stomach, persisted the reporter. The scientist did not reply. Hatch struggled with and suppressed the desire to ask more questions. On reaching home, the professor's first act was to consult the encyclopedia. After several minutes, he turned to the reporter. Of course, the idea of natural death in this case is absurd, he said shortly. Every fact is against it. Now, Mr. Hatch, please get me all the local New York papers for the day the body was found, not the day after. Send or bring them to me, then come again at 5 this afternoon. But, Hatch blurted. I can say nothing until I know the facts, interrupted von Dusen. Hatch personally delivered the specified newspapers into the hands of the professor, this man who never read newspapers, and went away. It was an afternoon of agony, an agony of impatience. Promptly at 5 o'clock, he was ushered into Professor von Dusen's laboratory. He sat half smothered in newspapers and popped out of the heap aggressively. It was murder, Mr. Hatch, he exclaimed suddenly. Murder by an extraordinary method. Who was the man? How was he killed? Hatch. His name is... The scientist began, then paused. I presume your office has the book Who's Who in America. Please phone and ask them to give you the record of Langham Dudley. Is he the dead man? Hatch demanded quickly. I don't know, was the reply. Hatch went to the telephone. 10 minutes later, he returned to find the professor dressed to go out. Langham Dudley is a ship owner, 51 years old, the reporter read from notes he had taken. He was once a sailor before the mast and later became a ship owner in a small way. He was successful in his small undertakings and for 15 years has been a millionaire. He has a certain social position, partly by the aid of his wife, whom he married a year ago. She is Eden Marson Bedling, the daughter of a famous bedding company. He has an estate on the North Shore. Very good, committed the scientist. Now we will go out and find something... Now we will find out something about how this man was killed. At North Station, they took a train for the small place on the North Shore, 35 miles from Boston. There, Professor von Dusen made some inquiries, and finally they entered a lumbersome vehicle and drove off. After a drive of half an hour through the dark, they saw the lights of what seemed to be a pretentious country place. Somewhere off to the right, Hatch heard the roar of the restless ocean. Wait for us, commanded von Dusen. He ascended the steps, followed by Hatch, and rang. After a minute or so, the door was opened, and the light flooded out. Standing before them was a Japanese, a man of indeterminate age with the graven face of his race. Is Mr. Dudley in? Said the thinking machine. He has not the pleasure... The Japanese... pages stuck together. I always hate that happens. Okay. Hate doing accents. He has not the pleasure, replied the Japanese, and Hatch smiled and queerly turned phrase. Mrs. Dudley? Asked the scientist. Mrs. Dudley is attiring herself in clothing, replied the Japanese. If you will please be entered to... If you will be in... Yeah. Again, me not getting this. If you will be pleased to enter... Professor Von Dusen handed him a card and was shown to the reception room. The Japanese placed chairs for them with a courteous precision and disappeared. After a short pause, there was a rustle of silken skirts on the stairs, and a woman, Mrs. Dudley, entered. She was not pretty. She was stunning, rather. Tall, of superb figure, and crowned with a glory of black hair. Mr. Von Dusen? She asked as she glanced at the card. The professor bowed low, albeit awkwardly. Mrs. Dudley sank down on the couch, and the two men resumed their seats. There was a little pause. Mrs. Dudley broke the silence at last. Well, Mr. Von Dusen, if you... she began. You have not seen the paper for several days, asked the professor abruptly. No, she replied wonderingly, almost smiling. Why? Can you tell me just where your husband is? He squinted at her with that aggressive way which was habitual. A quick flush crept into her face and grew deeper at the sharp scrutiny. The inquiry lay in her eyes. I don't know, she replied at last. In Boston, I presume. You haven't seen him since the night of the ball? No, I think it was 1:30 that night. Is his motorboat here? I really don't know. I presume it is. May I ask the purpose of this questioning? The professor continued to squint at her for half a minute. Hatch was uncomfortable, even half resentful, at the sharp, cold tone of his companion. On the night of the ball, the scientist went on, pressing the question, Mr. Dudley cut his left arm just above the wrist. It was only a slight wound. A piece of court plaster was put on it. Do you know if he put it on himself? If not, who did? I put it on, replied Miss Dudley, unhesitatingly, wonderingly. And whose court plaster was it? Mine. I had some in my dressing room. Why? The scientist rose and paced across the floor, glancing out at the hall door. Miss Dudley looked at Hatch inquiringly, and was about to speak when the professor was stopped beside her and placed his slim fingers on her wrist. She did not resent the action, was only curious, if one might judge from her eyes. Are you prepared for a shock? The scientist asked. What is it? She demanded suddenly. The suspense! Your husband is dead, murdered, poisoned, said the scientist with sudden brutality. His fingers lay on her pulse. The court plaster which you just put on his arm, and which came from your room, was covered with a virulent poison which is instantly transfused into his blood. Mrs. Dudley did not start or scream. Instead, she stared up at the professor a moment. Her face became pallid. Then a little shiver passed over her. Then she fell back on the couch in a dead faint. Good, remarked Van Dusen complacently. And then, as Hatch started up, suddenly, shut that door! The reporter did so. When he turned back, his companion was leaning over the unconscious woman. After a moment, he left her and went to the window where he stood looking out. As Hatch watched, he saw the color returning back to Mrs. Dudley's face. At last she opened her eyes. Don't get hysterical, Professor Von Dusen directed calmly. I know you had nothing whatsoever to do with your husband's death. I only want a little assistance to find out who killed him. Oh, my God, exclaimed Miss Dudley. Dead? Dead? Suddenly, tears leapt from her eyes, and for several minutes the two men respected her grief. Then at last she raised her eyes, and raised her face. Her eyes were red, but there was a rigid expression about her mouth. "If I could be of any service," she began. "Is this the boathouse I see from the window?" asked the professor irritably. "How long low building with the light over the door?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Dudley. "You say you don't know if the motorboat is there now?" "No, I don't." "Will you tell your Japanese servants, and if he doesn't know, let him go down and see, please?" Mrs. Dudley arose and touched the electric button. After a moment, the Japanese appeared at the door. "Osaka, do you know if Mr. Dudley's motorboat is in the boathouse?" she asked. "No, honorable lady." "Will you find out, please? Go yourself and see." Osaka bowed low and left the room, closing the door gently behind him. The professor again crossed to the window and sat down, staring out into the night. Mrs. Dudley asked questions, scored of them, and he answered them in order until she knew the details of the finding of her husband's body, that is, the details the public knew. She was interrupted by the appearance of Osaka. "I do not find the motorboat in the house, honorable lady." "That is all," said the scientist. Again, Osaka bowed and retired. "Now, Mrs. Dudley," resumed the professor, almost gently, "we know your husband wore a French naval costume at your masked ball. May I ask what you wore?" "It was a Queen Elizabeth costume," answered Mrs. Dudley. "Very heavy, with a long train." "And if you could let me see a photo of Mr. Dudley." Mrs. Dudley left the room, returning immediately with a cabinet photograph. Hatch and the scientist looked at it together. It was unmistakably the man from the motorboat. "You can do nothing yourself," said the professor at last, and he moved as if to go. "Within a few hours we shall have the guilty person. You may rest assured that your name will be in no way brought into this unpleasant matter." Hatch glanced at his companion. He thought he detected a sinister note of a soothing voice, but the face expressed nothing. Mrs. Dudley ushered them into the hall. Osaka stood at the front door. They passed out, and the door closed behind them. Hatch started down the steps, but the professor stopped at the door and tramped up and down. The reporter turned back in astonishment. In the dim, reflected light, he saw the scientist's finger raised, enjoining the silence. Then he saw himself lean forward with his ear pressed to the door. After a little, he rapped gently. The door was opened by Osaka, who obeyed the beckoning motion of the scientist's hand and came out. Silently, he was led to the veranda and to the yard. He appeared in no way surprised. "Your master, Mr. Dudley, has been murdered," said the professor quietly to Osaka. "We know that Mrs. Dudley killed him," he went on, and Hatch stared at him in sudden amazement. "But I have told her that she is not suspected. We are not officers and cannot arrest her. Can you go with us to Boston without the knowledge of anyone here and tell what you know about the quarrel between husband and wife to the police?" Osaka looked placidly into the eager face. "I had the honor to believe that the circumstances would not be recognized," he said finally. "Since you know, I will go." "We will drive down a little way and wait for you." The Japanese disappeared into the house again. Hatch was too astounded to speak, but followed the professor into the car. It drove away 100 yards and stopped. After a few minutes, an impalpable shadow came toward them through the night. The scientist peered out as it came up. "Osaka?" he asked softly. "Yes." An hour later, the three men were on the train, Boston bound. Once comfortably settled, the scientist turned to the Japanese. "Now, if you please tell me what happened on the night of the ball? He asked. And the incidents leading up to the disagreements between Mr. and Mrs. Dudley. He drank elaborately, Osaka explained reluctantly in his quaint English, and when drinking he was brutal to the honorable lady. Twice with my own eyes I saw him strike her, once in Japan, where I entered his service while they were on their wedding journey, and once here. On the night of the ball he was immeasurably intoxicated, and when he went dancing he fell down to the floor. The honorable lady was chagrined and angry. She had been angry before. There was some quarrel which I am not comprehensive of. They had been widely divergent for several months. It was, of course, not prominent in the presence of others. And the cut on his arm where the court plaster was applied, said the scientist. Just how did he get that? It was when he fell down, continued the Japanese. He reached to embrace the carved chair, and the carved wood cut his arm. I assisted him to his feet, and the honorable lady sent me to her room to get court plaster. I acquired it for her dressing table, and she placed it on the cut. That makes the evidence against her absolutely conclusive, remarked the professor, as if finally. There was a little pause, and then, do you happen to know just how Mr. Dudley placed the body in the boat? I have not the honor of knowing how she did it, said Osaka. Indeed, I am not comprehensive of anything that happened after the court plaster was put on, except that Mr. Dudley was affected some way and went out of the house. Mrs. Dudley, too, was not in the ballroom for many minutes or so afterwards. Hutchinson Hatch stared frankly into the face of the professor. There's nothing to be read there. Still deeply thoughtful, Hatch heard the brakeman call Bob. Bosun! And mechanically followed the scientist and Osaka out of the station to the cab. They were driven immediately to police headquarters. Detective Mallory was just about to go home when they entered the office. I may enlighten you, Mr. Mallory, announced the scientist coldly, to know that the man in the motorboat was not a French naval officer who died of natural causes. It was Langham Dudley, a millionaire shipowner. He was murdered. It just so happens that I know the person who did it. The detective arose in astonishment and stared at the slight figure before him inquiringly. He knew the man too well to dispute any assertion he might make. Who's the murderer? He asked. The professor closed the door, and the spring lock clicked. That man there, he said calmly, turning to Osaka. For one brief instant there was a pause and silence. Then the detective advanced upon the Japanese with hand outstretched. The agile Osaka leapt suddenly as a snake strikes. There was a quick, fierce struggle, and Detective Mallory sprawled out on the floor. There had been a twist of wrist, a trick of jiu-jitsu, and Osaka had flung himself at the locked door. As he fumbled there, Hatch, deliberately and without compunction, raised the chair and brought it down on his head. Osaka sank to the ground without a sound. It was an hour before they brought him around. Meanwhile, the detective had patted and petted half a dozen suddenly acquired bruises, and had then searched Osaka. He found nothing to interest him save a small bottle. He uncorked it and started to smell it. Then the professor snatched it away. You fool! That'll kill you! He exclaimed. Osaka sat, lashed hand and foot to the chair in Detective Mallory's office, so placed by the detective for safekeeping. His face was no longer emotionless. There was fear and treachery and cunning there. So he listened perforce to the statement of the case of the professor, who leaned back in his chair, squinting steadily upward with his long, slender fingers pressed together. 2 and 2 make 4, not sometimes, but all the time, he began at last, as if disputing some previous assertion. As the figure 2, wholly disconnected from any other, gives small indication as a result, so it is isolated fact that's of little consequence. Yet that fact added to another, and the resulting fact added to a third, and so on, will give a final result. That result, if every fact is considered, must be correct. Thus, any problem may be solved by logic. Logic is inevitable. In this case, the facts, considering singly, might have been compatible with either natural death, suicide, or murder. Considered together, they proved murder. The climax of this proof was the removal of the maker's name from the dead man's shoes, and the fact strongly contributory was the attempt to destroy the identity of the boat. A subtle mind lay back in all of it.
So I regarded it, said Detective Mallory. I was confident the murder until the medical examiner.
We proved the murder, the Professor went on serenely. The method? I was with Dr. Clow in the autopsy. There was no shot or knife wound, no poison in the stomach. Knowing there was a murder, I sought further. Then I found the method in a slight, jagged wound on the left arm. It had been covered with court plaster. The heart slowed constriction without apparent cause, and while Dr. Clow examined it, I took off the court plaster. Its odor, an unusual one, told me that the poison had been transfused into the blood through the wound. So 2 and 2 had made 4.
Then,
what poison? A knowledge of botany aided me. I recognized faintly the trace of an odor of an herb which is not only indigenous to, but grows exclusively in Japan, thus a Japanese poison. Virulent, but necessarily slow, and acts the cause does not be placed directly on an artery. The poison on the court plaster and that you took from Osaka are identical.
the scientist uncorked the bottle and permitted a single drop of the green liquid to fall on his handkerchief. He allowed it a minute or two for evaporation, then handed it to Detective Mallory, who sniffed at it with respectful distance. Then the professor produced a bit of the court plaster he had taken from the dead man's arm, and again the detective sniffed.
The same, the scientist resumed, as he touched the lighted match to the handkerchief and watched it crumble to ashes. And so powerful that in its pure state, the mere inhalation is fatal. I permitted Dr. Clue to make public his opinion, heart failure, after the autopsy for obvious reasons. It would reassure the murderer, for instance, if he saw it printed, and besides, Dudley did die of a heart failure. The poison caused it. Next came identification. Mr. Hatch learned that no French warship had been within 100 miles of Boston for months. The one seen by Captain Boyer might have been one of our own. This man was supposed to be a French naval officer, and had been dead less than 8 hours. Obviously, he did not come from a ship of his own country. Then from where? I know nothing of uniforms, yet I examined the insignia on the arms and shoulders closely, after which I consulted my encyclopedia. I learned that while the uniform was French and anything else, it was really the uniform of no country. Because it was not correct, the insignias were mixed. Then what? There were several possibilities. A fancy dress ball seemed probable. Absolute accuracy would not be essential there. Where had there been a fancy dress ball? I trusted to the newspapers to tell me that. They did. A short dispatch from the place on the North Shore showed me that on the night before, a man was found dead there had been a fancy dress ball at the Ladley Dudley estate. Now it is necessary to remember every fact in solving a problem as it is to consider every figure in arithmetic. Dudley. There was a D tattooed on the dead man's hand. Who's Who showed that Langham Dudley married Elizabeth Marston Belling. There was a EMB on the handkerchief in the boat. Langham Dudley was a shipowner, had been a sailor, and was a millionaire. Probably this was his own boat, built in France.
Detective Mallory was starting into the eyes of the professor in frank admiration. Osaka, to whom the narrative had thus far been impersonal, gazed as if fascinated. Hudson Hatch, reported, was drinking every word greedily.
We went to the Dudley place, the scientist resumed after a moment. This Japanese opened the door. Japanese poison. 2 and 2 were still making 4. But I was first interested in Mrs. Dudley. She showed no agitation, and told me frankly that she placed a court plaster on her husband's arm, and that it came from her room. There was an instant doubt that her connection to the murder. Her immediate frankness aroused it. Finally, with my hand on her pulse, which was normal, I told her the brutality that her husband had been murdered.
Her pulse jumped frightfully, and as it related the cause of death, it wavered, weakened, and then she fainted. Now, if she had known her husband was dead, even if she had killed him, a mere statement that he was dead would not have caused the pulse. Further, I doubt that if she could have disposed of her husband's body in the motorboat. He was a large man, and she did not a powerful woman. And against the manner of her dress, even against it, therefore would presume her innocence. And then, the Japanese Osaka here. I could see the door of the boathouse from the room where we were. Mrs. Dudley asked Osaka if Mr. Dudley's boat was in the house. He said he didn't know. Then she sent him to see. He returned and said the boat was not there. Yet he had not gone into the boathouse at all. Ergo, he knew the boat was not there. He may have learned it from another servant. Still, it was a point against him.
Again, the scientist paused and squinted at the Japanese. For a moment, Osaka withstood the gaze. Then his beady eyes shifted, and he moved uncomfortably.
I tricked Osaka into coming here by the ludicrous simple expedient.
The professor went on steadily.
On the train, I asked if he knew how Mrs. Dudley got the body of her husband to the boat. Remember, at this point, he was not supposed to know that the body had been in the boat at all. He said he didn't know, and by that very answer admitted that he knew the body had been placed in the boat. He knew because he had put it there himself. He put the poison on the court plaster when he went to get it. He didn't throw the body into the water because he had the sense enough to know if the tide didn't make it out, it would rise. After the slight injury, Mr. Dudley evidently wandered toward the boathouse. The poison was working, and perhaps he fell. When this man removed all identifying marks, even to the name of the shoes, he put the body in the boat and turned it on full power. He had a right to assume that the boat would be lost, or that the dead man would be thrown out. Wind and tide and a loose rudder brought it into Boston Harbor. I do not attempt to account for the presence of Mrs. Dudley's handkerchief in the boat. It might have gotten there in any one of 100 ways.
How did they know the husband and wife quarreled? Asked Hutch.
Surmised to account for her not knowing he was there, replied the professor. If they had had a violent disagreement, it was possible that he would have gone away without telling her, and she would not have been particularly worried, at least up to the time we saw her. As it was, she presumed he was in Boston. Perhaps Osaka gave her that impression.
The professor stared at the Japanese curiously.
Is that correct?
He asked. Osaka did not answer. And the motive? Asked Detective Mallory at last.
Will you tell us why you killed Mr. Dudley?
Asked the professor to the Japanese. I will not, exclaimed Osaka suddenly. It was the first time he had spoken.
It probably had to do with the girl in Japan, explained the professor easily. The murder has been a long-cherished project, such as one revenge as one would love to have inspired.
It was a day or so later that Hutchinson Hutch called to inform Professor von Dusen that Osaka had confessed and had given his motive for the murder. It was not a nice story. One of the most astounding things to me, Hutch added, is the complete case of circumstantial evidence against Mrs. Dudley, beginning with a quarrel and leading to the application of the poison over her own hands. I believe she could not have been convicted on such actual circumstantial evidence had you not shown conclusively that Osaka did it.
Circumstantial fiddlesticks, snapped the professor. I wouldn't convict a yellow dog of stealing jam on circumstantial evidence alone, even if it had been the jam all over its nose.
He squinted intrusively at Hatch for a moment.
In the first place, well-behaved dogs don't eat jam,
he added, more mildly. I don't know. I would eat jam. Why wouldn't a well-behaved dog eat jam? Jam is tasty. Anyway. I'm not going to be able to get into a third story considering how long these were taking me.
One cat has joined me. Maybe that's why I remember the name. Because all the time I kept thinking, I know the name Jacques Futrelle, but I couldn't remember why. I guess the Titanic thing might have been why. Which would make sense. Anyway. Should we raid another reader? As looks like Harp Griffin is doing Don Quixote. Oh, it's fun listening to Harp reading Don Quixote. Let's see, who else is on the reading and writing right now? Writing and reading, whichever one it is. Let's see. Hart Griffin. I don't want to try to get anyone to try to listen to Russian. Someone doing homework. Books and Bourbon looks like they're writing. Dolores is writing. Who is Muffin Hobbit? Okay, Muffin Hobbit is writing. So the number of readers is really kind of cut in half. And I think we'll just go ahead and rate Hart Griffin. So feel free to copy either red message that you have. We'll read out to Hart Griffin. Because, you know, I love listening to the reading Don Quixote. So hopefully you all have a wonderful evening, and I will see you possibly tomorrow night for some Friday Night Fairy Tales. Have a good evening, everyone.
Not so long ago, in a world full of strife, a man born a wolf, living a dual life. With magic in his veins, he walked the school hall, learning the arts, answering the call. But fear was a cloak he had to wear tight, hiding his truth, keeping darkness from light. Those who were scared turned away in despair, yet he bore the burden, he chose to take care. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from